This 1920 wedding portrait looked happy at first, until you notice what the bride is hiding in her hand. David Harper had examined thousands of photographs during his 15 years as a historian at the New Orleans Heritage Museum, but something about this one made him stop instantly. It was a humid Tuesday afternoon in April 2024 when he opened the latest donation from the estate of Eleanor Roosevelt, a woman who had died at 103. Leaving behind boxes of family keepsakes that no living relative wanted. The photograph was carefully placed between layers of yellowed tissue paper, its silver frame tarnished but still strong. David gently lifted it into the sunlight coming through his office window. The image showed a black wedding couple from 1883. The bride wore an ivory gown with fine lace sleeves and a long flowing veil. The groom stood beside her in a neat dark suit with a boutonniere pinned to his lapel. They posed in front of an ornate backdrop common in professional studios of that time. Their faces held that stiff calm early cameras required. The bride stood out. She was not traditionally beautiful by the standards of that era, yet her direct gaze felt powerful and impossible to ignore. Her dark hair was neatly arranged under her veil, and a strand of pearls rested around her neck. The groom stood slightly behind her, one hand placed formally on her shoulder, his expression serious and controlled. For a black couple to afford such a formal portrait in 1883, Louisiana, just 18 years after slavery ended, said a great deal about their determination to record this moment and claim their place in history. David turned the frame over, looking for clues. On the back, written in faded brown ink, were only two names, Clara and Thomas, June 14, 1883. Nothing else. He turned it back over and studied the photo again, impressed by how clear it remained after so many years, preserved with obvious care across generations. As the afternoon light shifted and hit the glass at a different angle, David noticed something odd. He reached for the magnifying glass he kept on his desk for studying old documents. Leaning closer, he focused on the bride's hands, clasped at her waist. In the traditional pose of brides from that period, that's when he saw it. Something was in her right hand. His heartbeat quickened as he adjusted the lens. Between her fingers, partly hidden by the folds of her dress and the angle of her grip, was a small piece of fabric. At first, it could have been mistaken for part of the dress or a simple handkerchief. Brides often held such items, but the way she gripped it, the careful placement, the visible tension even in a century-old photograph, suggested it was not just an accessory. David switched on the high-intensity lamp he used for archival work and placed the photograph beneath it. The stronger light revealed more detail. The fabric appeared white or cream, about the size of a man's pocket square, but there were markings on it. Tiny, deliberate markings that looked like careful stitching. His hands shook slightly as he took high-resolution photos with his phone and transferred them to his computer. Using photo enhancement software, he zoomed in and adjusted the contrast and brightness. The markings became clearer. They were not decorated designs. They looked intentional, organized, almost like symbols or coordinates. The stitches formed shapes that resembled numbers and directional signs, incredibly small and precise. David leaned back, his thoughts racing. In 1883, Louisiana was deep in the violent aftermath of Reconstruction. Black communities lived under constant danger. White supremacist violence was rising, civil rights were being torn away, and terror was used to force formerly enslaved people back into submission. For a black bride to hide something like this in her wedding portrait and to hold it so carefully suggested it meant far more than sentiment. He studied the groom's face again. Thomas's expression held a deep seriousness, not fear, exactly, but awareness, a heavy understanding that went beyond normal wedding nerves. Clara, too, showed slight tension around her mouth, as if she were holding her breath or suppressing something. David knew he had uncovered something important. But what? And why would someone hide coded information in a wedding photograph? The next morning, David arrived at the museum an hour early, the photograph safely stored in an archival sleeve inside his leather bag. He had barely slept. Before going further, he needed context. Who were Clara and Thomas? Where did they live? What was their world like in 1883 Louisiana? He began with the museum archives, pulling old record books and city directories from the 1880s. Thomas was a common name. but paired with Clara and the wedding date of June 14, 1883, he hoped to narrow it down. Hours passed as he scanned handwritten records, checking church registers, marriage licenses, and census data. The work was slow and demanding, but David knew history revealed itself only through patience. By mid-morning, he found something promising. A marriage license filed at the Orleans Parish Courthouse. Clara, age 24. Thomas, age 37. Married June 14, 1883. Thomas's OCC. Occupation was listed as carpenter, and their residence was noted as the TMA neighborhood, one of the oldest black neighborhoods in America, home to free people of color even before the Civil War. David felt a surge of excitement. TMA had long been a center of black culture, strength, and quiet resistance. If Clara and Thomas lived there, they were part of a close community that protected its own and understood that survival required strategy and not just hope. He searched property records next, and found that Thomas had purchased a small lot on St. Philip Street in 1881. Owning property so soon after Reconstruction ended was rare and meaningful. Most black families rented or lived in conditions barely better than slavery. David then searched newspaper archives. Papers like the Times-Picayune rarely mentioned black citizens, unless reinforcing racist narratives. But hidden among notices, he found repeated reports from 1883 and 1884 about black families mysteriously disappearing from New Orleans, especially from neighborhoods like TMA. The articles implied crime or irresponsibility, but David read between the lines and saw another explanation. He knew he needed expert help. He contacted Dr. Angela Freeman, a textile historian at Tulane University who specialized in 19th century needlework. She arrived that afternoon and examined the enhanced images closely. After several silent minutes, she spoke softly. This was not decoration. These were navigational markers. The patterns, the angles, the groupings were all intentional. Black communities had long used textiles to communicate secretly, from quilts to handkerchiefs to clothing hems. Angela explained that the stitching formed geographic directions, not modern coordinates, but a coded system using distance and direction, given the care taken to hide it in a wedding portrait. She believed it pointed to safe locations. The Underground Railroad did not end with the Civil War. It adapted during Reconstruction and after its collapse. In 1883, Louisiana was dangerous. Federal troops were gone. Violence ruled. Angela pointed to a dense section of repeated stitching. Repetition meant importance. These were critical places, safe houses, escape routes. Over the following days, David studied the history of TMA in the 1880s. He uncovered a story of a community under attack, yet refusing to disappear. A place built on dignity and resilience, slowly crushed as Reconstruction's promises were stripped away through terror and law. The Louisiana Constitution of 1879 had stripped most black voters of their rights. White supremacist groups operated openly, attacking black families without fear of punishment. The message was unmistakable. Black people would be pushed back into submission by any means necessary. David uncovered records showing that churches in TMA had served as gathering places and centers of resistance. Augustine Catholic Church, founded in 1841, had long been a foundation of the free black community. David wondered if Clara and Thomas had been married there, and whether the church had been connected to the network hinted at by the fabric's coordinates. He decided he needed to see TMA for himself, to walk the same streets Clara and Thomas once walked, to see if any trace of their world still remained. On a warm Saturday morning, he drove into the neighborhood and parked near St. Philip Street. The exact address listed in the property records no longer existed as its own structure. Over time, the lot had been absorbed into a larger development. Still, many nearby buildings dated back to the late 1800s, their worn exteriors standing as proof of survival. David walked slowly, imagining the streets as they were in 1883. Horse-drawn carts instead of cars, gas lamps instead of electric lights, and always the quiet awareness of danger. The understanding that violence could erupt at any moment without warning and without consequences for those responsible. When he reached St. Augustine Church, he found the parish office open. An elderly woman named Mrs. Delqua, a longtime parishioner and volunteer archivist, welcomed him warmly after he explained his research. Her eyes brightened when he mentioned the names Clara and Thomas, and the year 1883. "We have marriage records going back to the church's founding," she said, leading him into a small room lined with leather-bound ledgers. "Let's see what we can find." She pulled out a volume from 1883 and gently turned the fragile pages. There it was, written in elegant script. Clara, spinster, and Thomas, bachelor, joined in holy matrimony on the 14th day of June, 1883. But it was the note written in the margin that made David's heart race. Witnesses, Samuel and Ruth. Beside their names, in tiny writing that was almost invisible, was a single word: conductors. That word changed everything. David knew exactly what it meant. Conductors were the guides who helped enslaved people escape to freedom through the Underground Railroad. But the Underground Railroad was believed to have ended with the Civil War in 1865. Why would conductors still be identified in 1883, nearly 20 years later? Mrs. Delqua noticed the question on David's face. She motioned for him to sit, and carefully lowered herself into a chair, moving like someone carrying a lifetime of memories. "Young man," she said softly, "the Underground Railroad never truly ended. It changed." She explained that her grandmother, born in 1879, had lived through those years and told her stories. After Reconstruction collapsed, after federal troops withdrew in violence, returned even worse than before, black people still needed ways to escape. She lowered her voice, as if the walls might hear. They called it different names. The network, the chain, some simply called it the way through. It wasn't about running north anymore. That path was known and watched. This was about moving between fake communities, about disappearing when your name landed on the wrong list, when your family was threatened, when staying meant death. David showed her the enhanced photographs of the wedding portrait, pointing to the small piece of fabric in Clara's hand. Mrs. Delqua studied it for a long time, then nodded slowly. "My grandmother spoke of something like this," she said. She called them passage cloths. Women carried them because women were searched less often and suspected less. The information was hidden in plain sight, disguised as decoration or sentiment. David asked if she knew where the coordinates might have led. Mrs. Delqua stood and walked to a large map of Louisiana mounted on the wall, covered with pins and handwritten notes. "In the 1880s, she explained, there were several communities that took people in. Some were deep in the bayous where law enforcement rarely went. Others were farming settlements farther north, near the Arkansas border, where black families supported newcomers." Then she paused, her finger hovering near the Gulf Coast. There were also maritime routes, ships, black sailors, fishermen, dock workers. They moved people out through New Orleans harbor to ports like Mobile and Pensacola, even as far as Charleston. From there, people could start over, sometimes even leave the country. Some went to Mexico or Caribbean islands, anywhere beyond the reach of violence. David felt everything begin to connect. Clara's fabric might not have shown only land row, utes. It could have included ships, schedules, trusted contacts at different ports. The repeated stitching Angela had noticed likely marked the most reliable paths, the ones that had already carried people to safety. David asked about Samuel and Ruth, the witnesses listed as conductors. Mrs. Delqua's expression darkened. She said she could check the records, but she didn't finish the sentence. David understood. Conductors lived dangerous lives. Many vanished, were killed, or were forced to flee. Back at the museum, David and Angela worked late into the night. The wedding portrait filled a large screen beside old maps of Louisiana and the Gulf Coast. They brought in Marcus, a cryptography specialist from the museum's geography department. Together, they tried to translate Clara's stitched symbols into real location. Marcus explained that the challenge was reading a map from a world that no longer existed. Rivers had shifted. Roads had changed. Entire communities had disappeared. Angela had drawn careful sketches of every stitched symbol, numbering them in order. She laid them out and explained her theory. The first group represented starting points inside New Orleans. Short lines connected meeting places and safe houses. David compared the patterns to 1,883 street layouts in TMA. One coordinate aligned with an area near St. Augustine Church. Another matched a spot near the French Market, where crowds could hide secret meetings. A third pointed toward Bayou St. John, where via turways led into the wetlands. The longer stitched lines marked the escape routes themselves. One followed the Mississippi River northwest. Another led north toward Mississippi or Arkansas. A third curved southeast toward the coast. Marcus pulled up an 1883 shipping chart, showing regular routes between ports. A packet service between New Orleans and Mobile stood out. Small ships carrying mixed cargo and passengers, perfect for moving people quietly. Hour by hour, they pieced together an intricate network hidden in the shadows of 1880s Louisiana. Each coordinate Clara carried represented more than a place. It was a lifeline, a family's chance to survive. Near midnight, Marcus leaned back and said what they were all thinking. Clara hadn't carried this map only for herself. She was a conductor. Thomas likely was too. The wedding portrait wasn't just a memory. It was protection, a way to preserve vital information if other records were destroyed. David looked at Clara's face in the portrait with new understanding. She had been so young, yet she had risked everything. David needed to know what happened after the wedding. He returned to the archives, searching death records, property files, and census entries. He found Thomas first. In 1891, the St. Philip Street property was transferred to Clara alone. The word widow was written beside her name. Thomas had died between 1883 and 1891, still in his 30s. David found his death record dated March 1889. Cause of death? Injuries. Sustained. No explanation. In 1889 Louisiana, that phrase could hide almost anything. David sat quietly, feeling the weight of Thomas's life reduced to two vague words. But Clara's story continued. She appeared in the 1900 census, still living on St. Philip Street. Listed as a seamstress, living alone, she appeared again in 1910, now 60, still working, still there. Then David found the final piece. In oral histories collected in the 1930s, there was an interview with an elderly woman identified only as CR, age 80, from New Orleans. She spoke carefully, but her words were clear. She talked about helping families after her husband's death, about sewing special cloths women could carry, about fear, vigilance, and hiding what mattered most in plain sight. One passage struck David deeply. They took my Thomas for helping people get safe. Said he was interfering with the natural order. But freedom didn't end with the war. It had to be fought for every day. The cloth I carried on my wedding day was my promise. I kept it. Clara had continued alone for decades. David traced property records forward until he found a niece named Rose. From there, he located Patricia, Clara's great-great-niece. When he called her, she paused, then asked quietly if he had found Aunt Clara's wedding picture. They thought it had been lost in Katrina. They met the next day. Patricia showed him a shoebox filled with family items. She spoke of Clara as the bravest woman she'd ever known. David showed her the portrait and the fabric. Patricia wept softly. From the box, she pulled out another piece of cloth, larger, covered in the same tiny stitching. Then she showed him Clara's journal, hidden for decades. It was filled with coded notes about helping people escape. One final entry read, "Thomas, I kept my promise." 3 months later, David stood in the museum gallery at the opening of a new exhibition. Clara's portrait stood at its center, alongside the passage cloths and maps. Patricia stood beside him, proud and grieving. Visitors came, stories surfaced, and descendants recognized places and names. One man pointed to a coordinate and said it had been his great-grandfather's farm. Students stood in silence before Clara's portrait. When a young girl asked why Clara continued after Thomas died, David answered simply, "She was afraid, but she believed freedom was built through people helping each other survive." On June 14, 2025, Clara and Thomas's anniversary, the family gathered at the museum. As the gallery emptied, David stood alone before the portrait. What began as a wedding photo had revealed a hidden history of courage. Clara's stitched threads still connected past and present, reminding the world that resistance often lives quietly, carried forward by ordinary people making extraordinary choices.